Good evening. I'm Ambra Demontis from the University of Cagliari, and this work is a joint collaboration with Battista Biggio, Fabio Roli, Marco Melis, Maura Pintor from the same university as mine, and with Alina Oprea, Cristina Rita Notaru, and Matthew Jajeski from the Northeastern University. This work is called Why Do Adversarial Attack Transfer? Explaining Transferability of Evasion and Poisoning Attack. So let's briefly recap how a machine learning system works and where the attack can occur. So a machine learning system is basically trained on a data set. It extracts some features that are used to train the machine learning model. Then this machine learning model is used to classify new models. So basically, the input of the machine learning system are the training data and the test data. And an attack can potentially change both of them. So if the attack changes some test sample, the attack is called an evasion attack. And in this case, the goal of the attacker is to basically have that sample misclassified. In a poisoning attack, instead, the attacker changes some of the training sample to increase as much as possible the error of the classifier at test time. In our work, we consider both evasion and poisoning attack. And we consider two different levels of knowledge of the attacker. We consider a white box scenario where the attacker has a full knowledge of the machine learning system, so he knows everything about it, the training data, the weight of the model, etc. And we consider also a black box scenario where the attacker has basically just a query access to the model, which is a scenario more likely to happen because if, for example, an attacker would like to attack an antivirus, he probably will not know all the detail about the system. So in this case, what the attacker can do, so if he doesn't have knowledge about his target model, is to learn a surrogate model, so a different machine learning model. He crafts his attack against the surrogate, and he tries to use this attack against his target, basically. And if the attack is effective against the target, it is said that the attack transfers. So basically, transferability is the ability of an attack, which is devised against one machine learning system, to be effective against a different one. The problem at the state of the art regarding transferability were that there were basically some empirical evidence that evasion attacks sometimes transfer, but it was totally unclear which are the main factors behind the transferability of evasion attack, and moreover, it was not clear why basically they transfer, so in which context they transfer. So we propose an optimization framework that allows the attacker to compute both evasion and poisoning attack. We provide a formal definition of transferability, and we devise three metrics that help to better understand the underlying reason behind transferability. To validate the proposed metric, we did a comprehensive experimental evaluation. And finally, we studied the relationship between transferability and model complexity. So let's see why we choose to study this relationship. So we define model complexity as the capacity of the classifier to fit the training data that can be controlled through regularization. So suppose that you have a point, a one-dimensional point, and you would like to craft an evasion attack. against a classifier. So in this case, the loss of the attacker is exactly the loss of the classifier on that point. And if the adversarial point is under the black line, it means that the example basically is not able to evade the classifier. It is above, it means that it is able to evade the classifier. So as the loss function of the attacker depends strongly on the classifier, we suppose that the complexity of the classifier have a strong influence on the complexity of this loss function. So here we are considering a high complexity surrogate on the left and a low complexity surrogate on the right. And we crafted the adversarial point, so this evasion point, against both. So the adversarial point are as represented with the point actually red and blue. So regarding the adversarial point computed against the high complexity classifier, we can see that it's basically a local optimum. Instead, in case of the point which is devised against the low complexity surrogate, we can see which is the global optimum. This, of course, is due to the fact that the function on the right, it's really smoother and nicer, so it's easier to optimize. So if we try to transfer to Zattac against different targets, we see that the point that we devised against the high complexity surrogate doesn't transfer even with another classifier, another high complexity classifier that may be trained on a different training dataset. Instead, we see that the point which was computed against the low complexity classifier is more likely to evade both low complexity classifier and high complexity target. So we proposed a definition of transferability, which is the following. So we define transferability as the loss achieved by the target classifier, which is parameterized by W, on a point, on an adversarial point, X star, which is basically a test point X plus a perturbation, which is crafted on the surrogate. So here we have our target, for example, and we would like to compute an evasion attack. So we would like to have the sample, the test sample 8, misclassified as a 9. The attacker doesn't know the target, he knows just the surrogate. So what he can do is compute the attack against the surrogate, and how he can do? He can use a gradient-based algorithm. And the first gradient-based evasion and poisoning algorithm were devised in the 2013 and 2012 by Biggio et al. And then there have been a lot of work regarding evasion attack, while there is less work regarding poisoning. But going back to our example, if we suppose that the attack can make just one iteration, the optimal perturbation in this case will be the one which is aligned with the gradient of the surrogate. And we will found this adversarial sample that in this case is not able to transfer. So it basically gone through the decision region of the surrogate, but not the one of the target. So if we consider how much the loss increment on the target due to the perturbation, which is computed on the surrogate, so which is computed on the black box case, and we have there like delta L beta BB that stay for black box, and we multiply and divide it for the delta that we have in case we compute basically the attack directly on the target, we get this formula, which is made by two different factors that are the first two metrics that we proposed. So let's see them one by one more in detail. So let's start from the size of the input gradient. So it basically evaluates how much the loss increment on the target classifier under the attack. So it gave you a measure of the vulnerability of the target classifier, basically. And the intuition behind this metric is that it captures the sensitivity of the loss function to input perturbation. The second metric is the gradient alignment. And it basically evaluates the ratio between the increment of the loss if we compute the attack in the black box case respect to the one if we compute the attack in the white box case. And we call it gradient alignment because that's basically the cosine of the gradient of the loss basically that we have if we consider the target and the one that we have if we consider the surrogate. The third metric is the variability of the surrogate loss landscape. So it basically measures how much the loss function change depending on the training data set. So we devised this metric because typically the attacker doesn't have access to the training data set, so it has to use a different one. We did experiment on different datasets, a toy dataset which is missed, and we did the Evasion experiment on an Android malware detection task, while we did the poisoning experiment on a face verification task. We consider a lot of different classifiers, like reach, logistic, SVM, neural network, etc. And for each classifier, we consider an high complexity version and a lower complexity version. We did different experiments in white box scenario, black box scenario, and we compute the correlation between the proposed metric and the transferability. We analyzed also the relationship with the model complexity, and we made some statistical tests to validate our hypotheses and the correlation that we found. So let's see just some experiments. So an interesting research question is that, okay, are the target classifier with larger input gradient more vulnerable? Because basically this was one of the metrics that we devised. So the problem is that we devised it under a linearity assumption. So it may not hold, and we verify experimentally that actually it holds. So here, that's a white box scenario, and basically we are measuring the evasion rate. When the power of the attacker increases, so here the power of the attacker basically is the number of features that he can change. We have one color for each different family of classifier, and we have represented with a solid line the high complexity classifier, and with a dotted line the low complexity classifier. So we see that the high complexity classifier are basically always more vulnerable. And looking at the gradient size, we see that effectively the classifier that have an higher complexity have an higher gradient size. So basically, higher complexity model have a larger gradient, and target with a larger gradient are more vulnerable. Another interesting research question is related to the gradient alignment. So we ask here if the gradient alignment is correlated with the difference of the perturbation computed considering the target and the surrogate model. this experiment always because we have devised also the gradient alignment metric with a linearity assumption. So we can see that in these matrices, there is a strongly common pattern, so they are basically correlated. The measures, of course, are basically correlated. So we have talked just about evasion attack. But it turned out that regarding the poisoning, the findings are basically the same. So here we have something more which they have in common. So here we have basically some adversarial example, which is devised against low complexity classifier and highly complexity classifier. So we can see that the adversarial example, which are computed against lower complexity classifier, are really more perturbed. And this evaluates the hypothesis that we did at the beginning, that when we attack an high complexity classifier, we may end up basically with an adversarial point that corresponds to a local optimum. A difference with the evasion is that basically, in case of poisoning, the best surrogate are the ones which have the same complexity as the target. So to summarize, we proposed a definition of transferability and different metrics that help to better understand how transferability works. And moreover, we studied the relationship with the complexity. We made a lot of experiments, and the main findings are that highly complexity models are more vulnerable to both evasion and poisoning attack. Low complexity models are the best surrogate for evasion attack, while in case of poisoning, the best surrogate are the ones which have almost the same complexity as the target. We released the code, which is available at this link. So if you have any question, I will be pleased to answer.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we have time for probably one question. Yes, thanks, Rachel.
I might have missed something, but I was trying to understand the low complexity models are better surrogates. It would seem that like with a low complexity model, like you're going to be more likely of having your evasion succeed, but it also seems like if you're too low complexity, you might be, your evasion might end up being a higher cost than it would otherwise need to be. Is that something that you saw?
So yes, low complexity models are better surrogate in case of evasion. And regarding the cost, what you mean exactly?
Right. Like, well, do you end up evading more than you need to if your model is lower complexity than it had to be? Is my question. If you're trying to transfer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, we are not considering minimum perturbed attack. Okay, we are considering, well, we had this plot here. So we consider the vulnerability with an increasing attack power, because usually in the application, well, you doesn't know exactly which is the perturbation that the attacker is allowed to inject.
Right.
Okay. So even, for example, this was in case of Android malware detection. So it makes more sense see the vulnerability, when the attacker power can change. With the higher complexity model, if you have, if you have the same amount of allowed perturbation, you can get with a sample which is less modified.
Right, yeah.
Yes,
Anyway,
yes.
thanks.
That's true.
Okay, let's thank Ambra. Thank you.